Today we're going to talk about listening. When I was a younger man, I used to train jujitsu, and one day I was in the gym training, and I hear this guy scream, and I look over, and he's sitting on the ground, and he's holding his foot in his lap, and his toe is sticking out at a 90-degree angle, almost like a thumb sticking out of his foot, and he's just kind of like screaming and staring at it. And everyone rushes over, and everyone's got a solution. One guy's like, "Oh, just pop it back into place, it's fine." Another guy was like, "Oh, call an ambulance, call an ambulance." And there was a guy there who had been a military medic, he'd been in Afghanistan, and he rushes over and he's like, "All right, give him some space, give him some space." And the first thing he does is go up to the dude and go, "Hey man, what's going on for you? How are you feeling right now? What is this like for you?" Right? Because he wants to know how bad the injury is and everything. So even in a situation like that, where it's an emergency, where someone's injured, where we're talking about bodily harm, the first thing an expert does is listen, is try to understand the situation from the other person's perspective. Listening is the foundational, I don't even want to say leadership skill, it is the foundational life skill. It is the way that we connect to and understand and influence people. It's not through talking, it's through listening. If you guys take away no skill from this class other than listening, I am satisfied. And listening is a skill. It can be learned and it can be developed. In fact, everything we're going to talk about today, it's not going to be like mind-blowing stuff. It's stuff you already know how to do, stuff that you automatically do when you are interested and engaged with someone. And we're going to talk about how to take those skills that you already have, that you use in certain situations already, and apply them to situations where they're really important and you might not be using them. Situations like when you're really angry or upset at someone. Situations like when you need to give feedback to someone. Situations like when you need to persuade someone. And so we're taking these skills that you already have and we're honing in on exactly what they are so we can transfer them to other aspects of your life where they're really important and really effective. Many of us struggle to listen effectively, and it's not your fault. It's not because you're a bad person. There's a very good reason why it's difficult to be a good listener, and it's because most people talk at about 120 words a minute, and we can comprehend up to 400 words a minute. So most of the time, when someone's talking to you, you're basically painfully bored because it's taking up such a limited amount of your processing capacity. And that's why we're always thinking about other things when we're listening to people, or why we're trying to get ahead of them. It's because we can literally, our brain is working faster than the other person can speak. So if you are a bad listener, don't feel too bad about it. It's just kind of a quirk of our human mind. And you can get better through practice. Today we're going to talk about the 6 concrete skills that contribute to effective listening, or active listening. Using these 6 skills together is called active listening. The first is listening to understand the other person. The second, ask open-ended questions. The third is to observe nonverbals. The fourth is to use minimal reinforcers. The fifth is to embrace silence. And then lastly, we have restate the message. And together, these 6 skills form active listening. So we're going to start today by talking about listening to understand, which to me is really the bedrock of active listening. All the other aspects of active listening we're going to talk about today are really just supporting this main idea of you're genuinely trying to understand and connect to the other person. This is how most conversations go. One person in the conversation will state their perspective on something, and then the second person in the conversation will state their own perspective. The first person will state their opinion, the second person will state their own opinion. The first person will state their feelings, the second person will state their own feelings. This is not an actual conversation. This is 2 parallel conversations where the woman's talking about herself and the man's talking about himself. And they might be talking about the same topic, but they're actually talking about 2 very different things within that topic, right? The woman's talking about her opinion, feelings, and perspective on something, and the man is talking about his own experience. And they're both talking about themselves. They're both talking about different things as opposed to talking about the same thing. And this is what I mean by that. In a good conversation where you have good listening, the first person will state their perspective. And then the second person will go back to the first person's perspective. They don't pivot the conversation to them and their perspective. They stay with the other person says, I see the world this way. And the listener says, oh, so it sounds like you see the world. And they keep it on that first person. The first person will state their opinion, and again, the second person, it goes back to the first person's opinion. The first person will state their feelings, and the second person will state the feelings of the first person. And so now we're having a conversation. We're not two parallel conversations. It's one conversation where we're both talking about this woman's experience of the world. That's what a good conversation looks like. So this all goes back to trying to understand the person, listening to understand. You want to understand the person's perspective on the world, and that is the point of being a good listener. I love this cartoon, despite how ugly it is. You see these two men, and one of them is looking at this object, and he's saying there's 4 pegs, and then the other man is looking at the object, and he's saying, no, there's 3 pegs. Neither of these men are right, neither of these men are wrong. Both of them are correct from their own perspective. And when we talk about listening to understand, it's about trying to understand the other person's perspective and seeing it as valid, even if you don't agree with it. Too often, we mistake our perspective for reality. We think that the way that we see the world is the way that the world is. But our perspective on the world is just that. It's one of an infinite number of perspectives that people have. And, that's not to say that some perspectives aren't more valid than others, that some people aren't more right about certain things than others. Like there is right and wrong, and people can be more or less accurate with how they see the world. But none of us are perfectly accurate. None of us are even close to perfectly accurate. And by listening to understand, you get data points about what the world looks like to other people. The world is so complex, you cannot understand it by yourself. And by listening to other people, you get to see the world from all these different perspectives. And you can't do that if you're always telling them that they're wrong, that because they see the world differently than you, they're wrong. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, right? Like they might see the world in a very different way than you, and you want to understand where they're seeing it from, but you don't have to agree with where they're seeing it from. And I think this is why we're bad listeners sometimes. If we meet someone with like very different political beliefs than us, for example, and we're like, listening to them, it almost feels like we're like capitulating, or like somehow just by being a good listener, we're admitting that they're right and we're wrong. That is not the case. That being a good listener doesn't mean that you're agreeing with the other person. And you can be incredibly curious about the other person's perspective and to want to understand that without necessarily agreeing with them. Often we don't listen to understand, we listen to judge. And what I mean by judge in this case is we immediately have a strong feeling about how the information or how the other person's perspective impacts us. And that's what I mean by judgment. We judge, is this a good thing for me or is this a bad thing for me? So one of my good friends, she's married, she's in her early 30s, her husband is an EMT, and he comes home from work one day and he's like, all right, I've decided I'm gonna quit my job, I'm going to medical school, I'm gonna get my MD. And he's like really excited to tell her this, right? It's like he's so excited about this idea and his commitment to it. And she just flips out at him. She's like, hey, I want to start a family. We talked about having kids. We can't have children if you're going to be gone all the time studying, if we're going to be broke because you're going to school. You are not going to medical school. That is not happening. And they got in a huge fight about it. And of course, what was happening is he was sharing this news with her, and her first, where our mind just implicitly goes, is how does this information impact me? How does this impact me? And that's the first thing that she thought of. So instead of being like, hey, okay, so like, why do you want to do this? Why do you think now's a good time? How do you think this will affect our plans to start a family? Instead of like asking him questions and trying to understand his perspective, and he may have had great answers to all of those questions. Instead, she immediately jumps to a conclusion because based on how the information impacts her personally. That's what I mean by judgment. When someone tells us something, instead of being curious and open and trying to understand it, we often immediately jump to the conclusion of this is good for me, this is bad for me, and we act based on that. So avoid doing that. And my friend, I mean, she's a good friend of mine. She's not a particularly selfish person. This isn't supposed to be a critique of her. This is just a natural human thing that when people tell us something, we immediately go to, how does this impact me? The irony is that the closer we are to someone, the more we care about them, the more difficult it is to be non-judgmental. And that's because the people that we're closest to, their lives are intertwined with our own. And so whenever they make a decision, it's going to have a really powerful impact on someone. And the closer you are to someone, the more their decisions affect you. So whenever they tell you something, you always go to this place of like, okay, but how's it going to affect my life? I heard an NPR story about a woman who started a nonprofit to help mothers who had been alcoholics and were now sober reconnect with their family and like kind of undo the damage they had done through their alcoholism. And she was talking about these women and how much empathy she had for them, that they had like done these things because they were alcoholics and been bad parents, and how much they regretted it and wanted to reconnect with their family. And she had so much compassion for them. And yet she wouldn't speak to her own mother, who had been an alcoholic when she was growing up, because the pain is too direct, right? That she was the one who suffered from her mother's alcoholism. So for these other women, she can have compassion for them and see the story from their side. But from her own mother, she's unable to do that. She's unable to be non-judgmental because it had such an impact on her. So it's this irony of human relationships that the closer we are to people, the more judgmental we are of their decisions and their perspectives on the world. You know you are really good at listening non-judgmentally when someone tells you that you're a jerk and the very first thing you say is, tell me more about that. Like, man, I don't think I'm a jerk. Convince me. Like, what makes you think I'm a jerk? I'm genuinely curious. And not in this like condescending, oh, tell me why I'm a jerk. But like this genuine, like, what about my behavior makes you see me that way, and to genuinely try to understand their perspective of you being a jerk and not get defensive about it. And of course, remember, just because you're trying to understand them doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't mean that you have to agree that you're a jerk, but you at least want to understand why they think that. We're talking about listening to understand, but understand what? What are we trying to understand? There's three main things. One, we're trying to understand how the other person is perceiving the world. So like in this comic where it's the two guys looking at the optical illusion from different sides, in that case, we're really just genuinely trying to understand, how do you see the world? What do you see going on here? At a slightly deeper level is, how do they feel about the way they see the world? So we see the world differently, and because we see the world differently, we have different emotional reactions to that. So we can be looking at the same thing, we can be seeing it from different perspectives, and we can be having different emotional reactions to that. So you want to understand, how are people seeing the world and what are they feeling about it? One way we often try to give empathy is to share, if someone's sharing something difficult with us, we'll often share a similar experience that we had. So maybe someone will say, oh man, my dog just died. And we'll say, oh, I remember when my dog died in high school and what a powerful thing it was. And we're trying to use a shared a shared experience to connect to the other person, to build this empathy and give them that shared connection. That can be a useful tool, it can be a powerful tool, but you have to be really careful of not pivoting the conversation back to yourself. That it's not, oh, your dog died? Well, listen to the story about when my dog died, and you're pivoting the conversation back to yourself. If you use that, use it as a tool to connect to the other person and to share their experience, not to bring the conversation back to your own experience. And you know that you're really good at empathy. Again, this is just like listening to understand. You know you're really good at empathy when someone comes up to you and says, you're a jerk. And you're like, oh man, that sounds really hard for you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you have this experience of me being a jerk. And you know, when you can do that, you know that you're really good at providing empathy to people. The other thing that people need from you, or the other reason that people talk to you often, is because they need advice. They don't know how to do something, and so they're looking for your help with it. My sister's a tax accountant, and she helps me with my taxes sometimes. I call her up, and I'm like, hey, I don't know how to fill out this form. I don't need her to say, oh, that sounds really hard for you. Tell me about your difficulty filling out the form. Like, I'm not looking for empathy. I'm looking for advice, for structure. That is the rare exception. Most of the time, people are not looking for advice, and never give advice to someone unless they explicitly ask you for it. In How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie gives this great metaphor, which is, imagine that your friend comes to you and they say, man, I'm having trouble seeing, like my vision's getting a little blurry. And you go, oh, I used to have that exact same problem. And then my doctor gave me these glasses, and now the problem's totally fixed. Here, put my glasses on. Is that going to solve the other person's vision problem? No, of course not, because those glasses are for you. They work for you. They solve your problem, but they don't work for the other person. And that story sounds so stupid and so ridiculous that you're like, who would ever try that? You would never do it, right? And yet we do this all the time. When people come to us with problems, we tell them about what worked for us, and we insist they do what worked for us. But that's not, it may not work for them. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to understand and try to help them figure out what will work for them, not to give a lecture on what worked for you. When you give someone advice, essentially what you're telling them is like, your problems aren't that big a deal. Like, just do this thing and your problem will go away. And so it's really dismissive when people are really worried about something or really sad about something, and you're like, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? It doesn't drive connection, even if it's coming from a place of like trying to help them. It doesn't drive connection or make them feel better. Instead, it sounds like you're saying to them, your problems aren't that big a deal. Why don't you just go out and fix them? And so it feels dismissive. When you feel compelled to give advice, try giving empathy instead. And I promise you're going to be listening to someone over the next week, over the course of your life, and they're saying something, and you're like, oh man, I know exactly what you should do. I know exactly what you should do. And it's going to be in your head, and you're going to want to like interrupt them and say it. And the next time when you feel that compulsion, that need to jump in and give advice, instead, consciously say something like, oh man, that sounds really hard for you. Or, oh, that sounds so exciting. And instead of trying to tell them what to do, try to connect to them about their own experience and see how that goes, because I am confident that it almost always leads to a better outcome. The last reason that people talk to you is because they want you to change your behavior, that you're doing something that bothers them, or you're doing something that they really like, and they want you to increase one behavior or get rid of another behavior. And so often we talk to people, and the thing that we want from them is to change. We're going to talk a lot about feedback, so I won't dwell on it too much here, but just keep in mind when someone comes to you and they're giving you feedback, they're wanting you to change your behavior, try to understand where they're coming from. That's the initial thing you should do, is try to understand the source of the feedback and how they see the world. All right, so we just talked about how we listen to understand the speaker's perspective. The next skill we're going to talk about is asking open-ended questions. When we listen to understand, remember, we're trying to understand how the world looks like to the other person. We're trying to understand what their emotional reaction to that worldview is. And then we're trying to understand what they want from us. What do they want us to do about it? Do they want empathy? Do they want advice? Do they want us to change? Uh, so these are the things we want to discover when we're listening to understand. And open ended questions are a tool that we can use to discover these things. So when you think about what an open-ended question is, don't focus on it too much. I mean, it's just a question that helps you discover how the other person sees the world, how they feel about it, and what they want from you. Open-ended questions are tools to achieve that. So the technical definition of an open-ended question, the definition you're probably familiar with, is that an open-ended question is a question that you cannot answer with yes or no. And that's technically true. I'm using open-ended questions here in a much broader sense. An open-ended question is a question that encourages the speaker to elaborate more deeply. So, continuing with Tommy's bad cartoons, which is the theme of this lecture apparently, here's Where's Waldo drinking at a bar, saying to himself, nobody ever asks, how's Waldo? No one ever asks him these open-ended questions, these deeper ones about how he's feeling, right? It's these close-ended questions of where are you? Hilarious. So here's some examples of open-ended questions that you can ask. You say more about that. Tell me more about that. Whatever topic it is, elaborate. What makes you think that? Can you give me an example of what you mean by that? And of course, my psychologist is showing here. How does that make you feel? I get a lot of flack for this. People always tell me they would always feel like a jerk asking this. Like, how does that make you feel? I use this all the time at cocktail parties and stuff. Yeah, how do you feel about that? Or sometimes I'll do it like, man, that would make me really angry. What's your reaction to it? Something like that. I always try and drive conversations towards emotional content. I think it's easier to connect people when you're talking about how they feel about something rather than the thing itself. So I really do use this when I'm talking to people, and use this when I'm trying to get people to talk to me. You got to do these skillfully, though, right? Now, open-ended questions are really useful for this thing we call immediacy. Immediacy is the emotional experience of the speaker as they are speaking. Immediacy is basically how does the person feel as they're talking to you. This can often differ from the emotional content of the whatever they're saying. So, I can tell you a story about something I did in high school, and the emotional content of the story is like how embarrassed I was, right? I did something really embarrassing. And so the emotional content of the story is embarrassment. And yet, that's 20 years ago now. So as I'm telling the story, I'm laughing. My immediacy, my immediate emotional reaction might be happiness, humor, whatever it is. That's what immediacy is. It's not necessarily the emotional content of what the person is saying. It's how they feel when they talk about it. And often this is really important. I'll combine this with observing nonverbal behavior, which we'll talk about next. And I might say something like, "Oh, wow, I see you clenching your jaw as you're talking about this. Does this really upset you?" Or I'll say something like, "Oh, whenever you talk about this new job, a smile lights up your face. Like this, you must be really happy about this." And that's what we mean by immediacy, is driving the conversation towards talking about the person's in vivo emotional experience during the conversation. Thus far, we've talked about listening to understand the other person's perspective. We've talked about asking open-ended questions as a tool to understand how the other person's seeing the world, what their reaction to that is, what they want from us. The next thing we're going to talk about is nonverbals. By nonverbals, I mean body language, emotional expression, or facial expressions, emotions in one's voice, the tone and tenor of one's voice, basically anything that is not communicated verbally. People love the idea of reading body language, which I think is kind of funny, but we'll talk about it in a second. One of the most powerful observations that nonverbal behavior gives us is something that we call immediacy. Immediacy is the emotional experience of the person as they are speaking. And that's not always aligned with the content of what they are saying. So, for example, I could be telling you a story about something that happened to me in high school, and the story is really embarrassing, or it's like really, like the Tommy in the story is sad, and yet I'm telling this story, I'm laughing because this was so long ago and now I think it's funny. And so the emotional content of the story, which is sadness, embarrassment, is in contradiction to the immediacy, the emotional experience of telling the story. And it's okay if they're in contradiction, but you need to be aware of both. And sometimes they're in alignment and sometimes they're not. And so when we talk about immediacy, we're talking about what are people feeling right now as they are speaking. And nonverbal behavior gives us a lot of insight into that because we're often very good about censoring what we say. We are less thoughtful about censoring what we do with our bodies, with our voices. If you guys remember from business communication, a lot of students, when they were getting up to present for the first time and they were really nervous, they would sway back and forth the entire time. And I would say, oh, you swayed back and forth during the entire presentation. And they would be like, did I? Like they were totally unaware of how they were physically expressing their nervousness. So we're thoughtful about what we say. We're less, we censor our physical expression of our emotions less. And so by paying attention to people's nonverbal behavior, we can get insight into what they're feeling. All right. But first, some caveats. Man, there's all these shows like Lie to Me or like whatever about people with these amazing body language abilities, body language reading abilities, and they can essentially just like read people's minds. Or even now on like CNN, I see they bring in quote body language experts unquote. When politicians give a speech or when there's a debate and they try to assess what the person's thinking and feeling purely through their body language, right? I've heard, for example, that 93% of communication is nonverbal. That is not true. If 93% of communication were nonverbal, then like being deaf wouldn't be that big a deal. You're only missing 7% of the information, right? No, a lot of information is communicated verbally. It is important to listen to the verbal content of what people are saying, but body language provides this context for it. It gives us insight into people's emotions. So it is still very important. That being said, nonverbal behavior is highly ambiguous. So, for example, I am a restless person, and if I am ever sitting in a chair, I am bouncing my leg up and down. Um, Now, a body language expert would look at that and say, "Oh, Tommy's nervous about something." Maybe in like a deep existential way, I'm nervous about the fact that I'll die and life is meaningless. Maybe, but it's more likely that I'm just kind of a restless person. I do that when I'm sitting at home watching TV, perfectly relaxed. I shake my leg, right? There's not like this one-on-one interpretation of people's body language. It's ambiguous. Likewise, we see this guy with his crossed arm posture here, and if we had a body language expert, they would tell us that he's closed off, right? He's closed off to our ideas. It could also just be that he's cold. People cross their arms when they're cold. There could be a lot of reasons for it. So be really careful of jumping to conclusions just based on people's body language. Nonverbal behavior is also powerfully influenced by culture. So I lived in China for a year. They have very different cultural expectations when it comes to things like eye contact, also just facial expressions in general. Um, I had a friend there who worked in a jewelry store, and she got fired because she literally like did not smile. That They told her like, hey, if you're in the store when you're talking to customers, you got to smile, you got to look happy. And she grew up in a traditional part of China where people didn't smile a lot, and it was very uncomfortable for her. Eye contact is as well is very different there. Um, it's they make eye contact much less than we do in the United States. Making eye contact is seen as aggressive or hostile. So it's polite to look away when people are talking to you or when you're talking to other people. Intellectually, I knew this, right? Like I studied cultural differences between China and America. I knew intellectually that there was this cultural difference in eye contact, and yet at a gut level, at an emotional level, it still made me very uncomfortable, right? Like, why is this person not paying attention to me? Why is this person bored by what I'm saying, right? Why won't they make eye contact with me? So nonverbal behavior is ambiguous. It's also strongly influenced by culture. So you want to attend to nonverbal behavior holistically. And what I mean by that is don't pick apart, there's this like saying that like, oh, if people look to the right, if they look up into the right, they're lying. And if they look up into the left, they're remembering. As far as I know, none of that is true. There is not this kind of one-on-one mapping between people's body language, their nonverbal behavior, and what it means. Don't look at people's body language piecemeal. Look at it as a whole. Look at how they carry themselves. Look at how all of the gestures kind of fit in to how they're carrying themselves, and use that to make interpretations about what they might be thinking or feeling. Don't get caught up in details. One thing that you can look for in body language is something called mirroring. Mirroring is when two people in a conversation, they adopt the same posture, they adopt the same stance. If you've never heard of this before and you're just hearing it now, pay attention to the conversations you're having this week, and you'll notice that you'll look down and you'll see that you have adopted the posture of the person you're talking to, or you'll change your posture and you'll notice that the person you're talking to adopts your posture. It's actually very common once you notice it. This is called mirroring. People mirror when they are. It's like a natural thing. People do it unconsciously. They're unaware that they're doing it. They do it when they feel safe. They do it when they feel connected to the other person. They do it when they're interested in what the other person is saying. So if you notice that someone is mirroring you, then that's pretty good indication that they are interested. They're engaged in the conversation. So far, we've talked about listening to understand the speaker's perspective, using open-ended questions to discover how the speaker sees the world, what their emotional reaction to that worldview is, and then what they want from you. We talked about using nonverbals to assess how people are emotionally responding to things. The next two things we're going to talk about is using what we call minimal reinforcers to let the person know that you're listening, and embracing silence in order to give them the speaker time to think and process. We'll talk about those together because they're relatively short. So minimal reinforcer is a fancy term for nodding your head and going, uh-huh, yep, uh-huh, uh-huh, yep. That's minimal reinforcement. It's just a way to politely let the speaker know that you're paying attention. Sometimes, for example, when I'm like engrossed in listening to someone, I kind of lose track of myself, and I may appear, I'm so intensely listening that my face is flat, and I might appear bored or uninterested. So using those minimal reinforcers is just a way to let the speaker know that you're paying attention. We kind of consciously do this on the phone more often than we do it in person. On the phone, you want to make sure, you want to let the other person know that you're still there on the other end. So we often pepper our phone conversations with, uh-huh, mm-hmm, yep. And we do that less so in face-to-face conversation, partially because we're using other physical minimal reinforcers, right? We're smiling, we're nodding, we are making eye contact. All of those things are minimal reinforcers. It's just a physical expression to let the speaker know that you're paying attention to them. And then we'll talk about embracing silence. Embracing silence is very good to be a good listener. In the United States, at least, we do not like silence. We find silence uncomfortable. If there is open air between two people, we like to fill it with conversation. This can have a negative impact on our ability to effectively listen to other people. We often jump in and finish their sentence or for them, or try to guess where they're going in the conversation when they pause. The thing is that when that speaker is pausing, they're doing it so that they have time to refine their thinking. They're doing it so they have time to process their emotions. They're doing it so they have time to really invest in how am I going to communicate this to this other person. And when we jump in and fill that space, fill that silence with our own ideas, opinions, thoughts about what they're going to say, it takes away that opportunity for them to process. And we don't want to do that. We want to give them the time to process, to communicate as accurately and vividly their worldview to us as they can, the way the world looks through in their eyes. So when there's silence in a conversation, just embrace it, just lean into it. You can also, because silence makes us uncomfortable, you can also use silence as a way to get people to kind of elaborate more. So if someone says something and you notice you don't feel like you're getting the whole story from them, try just being quiet. Try just waiting and giving them that opportunity to finish the story, to go deeper into what they were saying with you. You don't have to. Sometimes silence is the best question. That you can use silence as a tool to get the other person to talk more, to elaborate more. And because you're not asking a question, because you're just using silence, you're giving them total control over where the conversation goes. So try embracing silence. See how it works for you. We have talked about listening to understand the speaker's worldview. We've talked about using open-ended questions to understand how the world looks to the speaker, how they feel about how the world looks, and what they want from you. We've talked about using or observing nonverbal behaviors to understand people's emotional state. We've talked about using minimal reinforcers and embracing silence to let the other person know that you're listening respectfully and get them to kind of elaborate on things more. And the very last thing we're going to talk about is something called restatements, where you restate what the speaker just said to you. Restatements really form the backbone of restatements, and open-ended questions are really the backbones of effective active listening. So a restatement is just what it sounds like. It's when you restate what the speaker has said to you. So you just take what they say and you paraphrase it. There are two main reasons for this. The first one is that it makes the speaker feel heard. By repeating back to the speaker what they have just said to me, paraphrasing it, not word for word, but paraphrasing what they've just said and repeating it back to them, I let them know that I'm actually paying attention to and remembering and processing this information they're communicating to me. The other thing that restatements do is it clarifies the speaker's point, where you're checking in to make sure that you've understood the other person correctly. We often do not understand the other person correctly. My girlfriend and I, whenever we have a disagreement, we always settle it on GChat. We find that it provides this you can't. It's less emotional. It gives you more time to think and process. So we have all of our arguments on GChat. And what's really interesting about that is you can go back and read the argument. I have realized so many times when I go back and read them, I realize that, oh my God, I was completely misinterpreting her. I was so obsessed with my own worldview that I was completely misinterpreting what she said. I wasn't listening to her, right? And by using restatements, by making sure that I can say back to her what she is saying to me, then I make sure that I actually have understood her correctly. And that is the point. That's one of the 2 points of restatements is to make the speaker feel heard, but also to make sure that you've heard the speaker. So restatements, like open-ended questions, restatements can focus on intellectual content. They can focus on, hey, how does the world look to the other person? Just describe this to me in a subjective way. So your restatements can focus on content. And actually, I noticed that customer service representatives start doing this. So for example, if I look at my credit card statement and I see there's a $50 charge that I don't recognize, and I call my bank, the customer service representative will say, how can I help you today? And I'll say, oh, I've got this $50 charge. I don't know where it came from. And the customer service representative will reply, okay, so it sounds like you have a charge on your credit card statement that you don't know where it came from. And they'll use this restatement. They want to make sure that they have correctly understood the problem that you are presenting. And they do this in an intellectual way, right? They don't ask emotional questions. They don't say, oh, so it sounds like you're really stressed out about this unknown charge. They just intellectually repeat what has just been said. However, restatements can focus on emotions as well. And you use restatements to say things like, so you were really angry about this. And I often use, I'll call them restatements because I'll say it that way, even if the person hasn't explicitly said that they were angry. I'll take a guess at the emotion I think that they're communicating to me. So I'll say something like, this really stresses you out. And then I'll give them time to clarify. So it's okay for your restatements to be kind of exploratory or to be wrong. Just be open to whatever the person has to respond. It's really just like a question. It's a cue to get the other person to talk more and to make sure that you understand correctly what they are communicating to you. And that is effective listening. We talked about 6 tools for active listening today. We talked about listening to understand the speaker, asking open-ended questions, observing nonverbals, using minimal reinforcers like yep, nodding your head, embracing silence, and restating the message. And that's it.